One of my dearest friends has just walked into the studio, and ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who are residents of the New Bedford area, the name Robert Waxler is synonymous with excellence in making one's life better through literature. Bob is an eminent professor of English at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and has for many years touched and changed the lives of students. He has multiple books, but his latest is a very interesting book titled The Risk of Reading and How Literature Helps Us to Understand Ourselves and the World. And I know that we didn't get a chance to hug before I got on the air, so come on over here, Mr. Waxler.
Good to see you, Phil. Radio.
It is that is a real radio. Well, first of all, you look absolutely wonderful.
Well, you do too, Phil.
Thank you, my friend.
You
Thank
really
you.
do.
Thank you. Our very best to Linda and to the whole family.
Thank you.
And you are very busy now. This is a brand new book for you.
It is.
What inspired the book? Tell us, what is it all about?
Well, as you just suggested, it's called The Risk of Reading, and it's about how literature, and when I use the term literature, I'm talking about primarily, well-known novels, which I discuss in the book, but how literature helps us to understand ourselves better as individuals and get better acquainted with the deepest parts of our own self, which are these days often hidden and repressed.
Right.
And at the same time, how literature helps us to locate ourselves better in the larger world so that we can feel as if the world itself is still accommodating for our own human identity, and that we, as individuals, we can still find a place for ourselves in the drama of the unfolding world.
Right. The risk of reading, how literature helps us to understand ourselves and the world. This is in paperback now, ladies and gentlemen. It's available.
It just came out this week.
Okay.
And so it's brand new.
Okay.
Amazon, I know, is just starting to deliver it. You get a Barnes & Noble, the bookstores. If they don't have it yet, we'll have it within a week or even less
Baker
than a
Books,
week.
Sure, the local.
Hopefully Barnes & Noble locally. And you can read it, you can also get it on, through Amazon or Barnes & Noble on, the Kindle or the Nook. But it's also in hardback as well. Eventually it'll...
Well, you told us what the value is of reading literature, whether it's Shakespeare or Tom Clancy. Tell us, is there proof? Is there proof that classic and popular literature truly has the power to inspire one's mind and to change the direction of one's life?
Well, here's at least part of the proof for me. And I mentioned this even in the acknowledgement page on my book. I have, as you know, been a professor at UMass for a long time now. And year after year, teaching the literature to the students and reading the literature, sometimes the same book a number of different times, I have continuously seen and been surprised by how the reading and the discussion of literature in the classroom and the effect it has on the students often is remarkable. I've seen by the end of a semester, I've often had students come to me and say, there's so many things that we discovered through the literature that have made me self-reflective, made me think about things that I really have a different view of the world by contrast to 14, 15 weeks earlier when I started the class. And that's been going on for several years now. And that's part of the inspiration, you might argue, for the book here. That the argument that I'm trying to make is that people have marginalized literature to the point where they don't really realize that potential power of it.
Why is that
think
happening?
about it.
Why is this marginalization happening?
Well, I think it has now a fairly long history. I think a lot of it has been accelerated, at least, by the digital age, as we might call it, by screen culture, by people continuously clicking on and off of the computer screens, and by an overwhelming belief that somehow the streaming of images, coupled with these often the feeling of sensation, which is very temporary on a computer screen, is much more valuable, the assumption is, than sitting down, which takes time, reading deeply, which is part of what I try to discuss in this book, The Risk of Reading, really contemplating things, and then being willing to not only read deeply and take that time, which is always a slow process, but talk to other people about the stories that you've read. Because I think the natural once you get into that depth of reading, there's a natural desire to share that with other people. You read a great story, you have a desire to talk about that story. And go out and talk to other people about it. Story evokes story. But that's a different rhythm of life. I think of it as, to me at least, that's a more human way of proceeding in the world. It keeps us together, gives us much more opportunity to build a human community.
Sure.
It makes us care about other people. I think there's even an ethical dimension to this. So all that, I think, is beginning to fray, if not fall apart.
And do you feel as though there could be a point where classical literature, even popular literature, could fall because of people pressing their thumbs on their telephones?
No, absolutely. I think that literature as we know it, and what I call literary narrative, that is it's like the curve of a story that's being told through language, and that you're participating in it and sort of reading through language. That all that is in serious jeopardy. And I try to link it in the book with the notion that this in itself may seem unimportant, but if you link it to the notion of what we've thought of traditionally for the last 500-600 years anyway as a human being, sort of knowing yourself, the depth of yourself, a human universe, then and think about it as reading as a way of sort of preserving that, then as we begin to see the end of literature, we really see the end of human identity as we know it. We might have some other way of thinking about what it is to be human and what a community is. But I don't see any, I'm not too optimistic about that future.
Joining me is Professor Bob Waxler, professor of English at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and not only that, but one of the co-founders of the nationally recognized alternative sentencing program for criminal offenders, a very important program, Changing Lives Through Literature program. And we can perhaps talk about that a little later on, but back to this digital age is, so what is the digital equal to George Eliot or F. Scott Fitzgerald or Mark Twain or Leo Tolstoy?
Well,
LOL.
Absolutely.
LOL, or we're speaking in another language here,
exactly
Bob.
Right. And that's a good way of thinking about it. Because as the language gets reduced in that form, and as you say, it's LOL rather than what might be thought of as a kind of long narrative of George Eliot or some other great writers. And, Twitter and a lot of the ways people communicate clearly suggests this reduction of language.
Right.
Coupled, by the way, with the notion that people increasingly are living a life which is online. Even when you're offline, you're continuously thinking about getting back online.
Yes.
So we know even within colleges now, you can see it with freshmen, for example. They have, in certain colleges, they have a week of orientation when freshmen come in. And one of the things that they've begun to do is to try to teach these incoming freshmen how to communicate face-to-face with their roommates. Because people tend, even if you're sitting next to each other, instead of turning to another person and talking to that person, you're emailing them, or you're on the phone, you're watching the screen, you're using your thumbs to operate.
Yes.
And when you think about that for a minute and just start to step back, there's a serious disconnection in terms of the humanity and the genuine sense of kind of interpersonal relations. When you're looking at somebody face to face, you feel the mood and the tone of another person.
Right.
And we see this over and over again in so many different ways within the culture now. Even online classes, which have become increasingly popular.
Mm-hmm.
The downside of that is that you don't any longer have a classroom, in many cases, where people can congregate, they can talk to each other, you feel the tone and mood, you can shift the discussion according to the overall sense of what is going on in the classroom. You don't have any of that with these online courses. Right. So there's something, in my estimation, dehumanizing about this. And also, again, instead of the richly textured feeling of an environment with language and talk and human discussion, you have a significant reduction of all that language. And without language, we, as human beings, we are diminished.
I want to ask you about the power of language itself. What is the role of language in a day of transition, in a time of transition like we're in right now? Yeah. What is the role of language anymore?
Well, again, I think it's within a mainstream culture, it's significantly diminished.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we have more and more images on the screen. We love colors. It's a life of spectacle. It's like a hyper reality, as if we're hallucinating rather than really grounded in what we are.
So there is a disconnect. You said it before. There is a disconnect.
I think that's absolutely right.
So here's the question, though. When you see the young students coming into the university, are they aware? Are the students themselves aware that the social media, that the phones and the way they're communicating is a disconnect from the popular and classical literature and the things that we used to talk about eye to eye and person to person? Are they aware of this?
Well, I think there is, as you're suggesting, clearly a significant, what we might term as almost a cliche, a significant gap here, right? A significant generation gap. People who have grown up with the computers and the the clicking and the clacking of things and the images, as you're suggesting, do not really know the experience of deep reading, so they have very little opportunity to make any kind of comparison. They assume, of course, as a result, when I talk about some of these things, that I'm out of it. I'm a dinosaur.
Yeah.
It's my problem, not theirs. But this also, in my mind, is a reflection on what an aspect of the problem is because what we have, instead of having a world where we at least put at the center the values of self-reflection, of deep, let's call it deep reading.
Right.
Of really knowing yourself in the old, Greek Socratic sense of what life should be all about and what it is all about. What we might think of as a kind of wisdom that you want to move toward. We have a substitution of values where what's really important is how quick you can do things on a screen, essentially. Smartness has much more to do with the skills of working a computer. The intelligence has almost exclusively things to do with how fast you can browse, the power that you feel when you're operating that kind of screen. That's a very different world and a very different culture.
Right. Get your ideas expressed in 130 characters or less.
And that's absolutely, which is also exactly what we were talking about before. Another indication of the reduction of language, of the expansion of not only language, but language as it works with the imagination. I mean, this is a very different world.
Take a step forward from that point. What is the importance of fiction in our lives, of understanding, things in our lives? Talk about that, because that's where imagination connects as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's, again, part of what I'm trying to get at in this book. I take a number of fairly well-known books that I imagine, over the long period of time, people have read. Old Man and the Sea, for example. I take up a chapter talking about that, Catcher in the Rye, right? And what I try to do is show that if you read with a lot of detail, slowly, if you take the time, if you sort of contemplate the movement of language, it excites your imagination. You begin to empathize with the character. You, in a way, become the character. But because it's language, it's like there's a doubleness to it. So as you move through the story, you are experiencing what the character's experiencing, but simultaneously you can think about it. So it exercises your imagination by bringing you into another world, so to speak, not the world of common everyday reality, but the other world. But simultaneously, you are also contemplating and thinking about these things, and you relate them to your own life and your own experience. So you see that the story is your story that you're reading, as well as the story of someone else, and you see both then the similarities and the differences between the two stories. And these are great exercise imagination.
You say that we are linguistic beings.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. Explain what that means.
Well, I think that in many ways it's language, linguistic language. Not computer language, in other words, but what we in the old days used to think of as words, language, and especially language shaped into narrative. But they make us who we are. We're genuine human beings, and at the center, the most valuable thing we have, the gift that we've been given of all gifts, is the ability to use language, to listen to people through language, to talk and to read and write in a larger context. And we know the world as human beings. We know the world first and foremost through language. It's not that the world doesn't exist without language, but to make the world human, we need language, and we see the world through our language, through the way we use language, through the stories that other people tell us. To a large extent, we often don't think about this, but we know the world through the stories that we have heard one way or another through the beginning of our experience and through the beginning of our lives, and we tell stories in that way. And that's how we interact with the world. We access the world that way.
Ladies and gentlemen, Robert P. Waxler is not only one of the greatest contributors to helping people understand who they are through literature, but truly one of the very best professors that the University of Massachusetts has ever had. He's professor of English at UMD and the co-founder of the Challenging Lives Through Literature program that does the same for folks who have fallen between the cracks in the law and whatnot. And his latest book is titled The Risk of Reading, and how literature helps us to understand ourselves and the world. I look at it, and you inspired this thought. You're familiar with the book of The Clash of Civilizations, but I believe this is also a clash of civilizations in this respect, Bob. I am one who likes to preserve tradition.
Good.
And we are in a war where that is being really eroded every single day.
Absolutely.
So we have a clash here of sorts, don't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that, too, is, in the largest sense, a little different perhaps than the way you're thinking about it, but that is part of what I think I'm trying to get at here in this new book, the sense of language.
Yeah.
And that in almost any traditional sense, when you go back, to the Greeks and actually even to the Bible, as I read the Bible, and I have in one of my opening chapters, I have a long discussion of the first 3 sections of Genesis in this regard, the kind of creation of the world and the gift of language and the importance of it, and the way Adam has an opportunity to name through language. And even at the beginning where, God says, let there be light. That's language becoming the world. When you think about it, right? He says, becoming the Word and the world. He says, let there be light, and there is light.
That's right.
So it's like the language and the world and the Word, in that sense, are very intricately and bound together. And in that context, to get back to the notion of tradition here, part of the argument that I'm trying to make in the book is that, look, as long as we as long as we have any sense of language going way back historically and traditionally, part of the understanding of what it is and was to be a human being, human identity, is wrapped up with the central sense of what language is all about for human beings and the importance of language. And again, what we were saying a little before, that the world is very much, if it's going to be a human world, we've got to use and think about language first and foremost. Language is what we are, linguistic beings, as first and foremost as human beings.
Right.
And if language deteriorates, and reading in this context more recently, reading and writing significantly deteriorate, we can take it as a pretty sure sign that at least the old traditional sense of what it means to be human and what the world should be and can be as a human world, those things are also deteriorating. They are somehow increasingly narrowing in their focus. We are no longer the same traditional sense of not living with the same traditional sense of what it is to be a human being. And again, I think this is really a crucial issue. It is not, I would argue, we were talking before about the electronic media and digital media. I would also argue that this is not just another transitional moment, which a lot of people like to say, So we're in a transitional moment. Now the argument is a couple of, next generation or so we'll have a new balance and a new sense of stability. I don't think so.
I don't either.
I don't think this, and I'm not trying to be apocalyptic about this. I'm just saying that this is not a transitional moment. There is a shift which suggests that this is going to go on because there's an increasing sense of instability and you can see the way digital culture works. It's they're trying to keep things unstable. You want to keep clicking. You want to keep online. You want to keep endless change, and it's not a positive thing.
Is it fair to put Tolstoy up against modern-day comic books? Because this is what we're... I hate to be that.
Yeah,
but
well, people do...
Hollywood is doing it.
That's right.
They're mimicking comic books.
Yeah, I'm not in favor of that. Part of my argument is that we're talking about really great literature. Great literature still offers an opportunity to move very deeply into unknown parts of your own self.
Okay.
And you do it through language. That's why, in a way, the title, The Risk of Reading in Part, means if you're really reading well and deeply, you're on a journey which is always risky because you're going to run into the depths of a narrative language, which is going to shake you up a little bit.
Right.
Because you're looking at something, and you're going to have to deal with something that is dangerous because it's not known to you yet.
Yes.
Even though it's part of you.
Yes.
So you're into new areas of yourself. That's always risky, but that's the expansion of our human identity. That's you. It's the imaginative possibilities of your life and your life in relation to other human beings in the world. That's risky, but that's extraordinarily valuable. You don't find that usually on a digital screen.
Exactly.
You're just getting back, the familiar stuff about yourself.
And now going into the world of reality of education, getting our children to learn to read, and then have a passion to read, have a love, have a desire to want to learn through reading.
Yeah.
I don't know about our the generations that are in college right now, Bob, but is that the generation we have to really focus on so that in 15, 20 years at least we can start influencing their evolution?
No, absolutely. There's a book that came out a couple of years ago that made me think a lot about things where the person is talking about the danger of losing what her name is Wolf, her last name. What she says is the reading brain. That is, that if you in this new digital culture, if we continue along this same direction, we're going to lose the capability, which we again have been building up for the last 500-600 years, of what we're calling here deep reading. So people may browse; they're going to look at things.
Sure.
But browsing and looking at the surface of things and moving quickly is not the same thing as reading deeply. And it's taken us a while to learn those things. And young people I see coming up, even in college now, seem to have at least temporarily lost that ability.
And what do you tell them
do it?
If somebody is honest enough to say, Professor, I don't know if I've ever done deep reading? What kind of guidance do you give them?
Well, that's so part of what I'm suggesting in this book and is related to what you're talking about, that we're not going to change the drift of this mainstream culture. And I'm not suggesting that we suddenly break all the screens, kind of Luddite old machinery. So that we take that as a given. And the people who are coming up now, who have been often not exposed very much to good literature and don't yet have all the habits that we might have taken for granted even 20 years ago. Sure. What I suggest to them is, look, the classroom here, what we're going to do, what I hope other teachers and professors around the country will continue to do, is to think about literature courses as a kind of countercultural activity, right? It's not as a springboard for a revolution of change completely, but as an opportunity to, at least temporarily, learn these other kinds of skills, the ability to, again, to read deeply, to be self-reflective, to discover aspects of yourself that you're not going to have much of an opportunity to really do in most of the other classrooms, in fact, and certainly not while you're on the smartphones or clicking and clacking on your screens day and night, or attempting to communicate through these Twitter messages in very short form. Right. So this is a countercultural activity, you might argue, to try to maintain the old traditional sense of what it is to be a human being, what a human journey can be and should be, in my view. That is an attempt before you die to get as close as possible to knowing yourself and to understanding, why you're on this earth in a way, and what your location in the world can be and should be, and how you can, in a sense, serve with gratitude the very incredible opportunity that everybody has simply existing in this world.
Yes.
Why are we here as a human being? That's really the fundamental question. What we have instead is, and again, I would suggest a lot of it has to do with an increase in the, this kind of quantified digital culture, the computational culture that we have. What we have is an increasing sense that the important things are speed and power and the kind of basic skills in how to do these computations. What we need is a little more understanding that there's a whole other dimension to human life, and that we're not born simply to make a living in that sense, to get vocational skills so we can make a little more money. There's a whole other world out there that makes us fully human, and we've got to keep that alive as well. That's the issue.
And this, ladies and gentlemen, this journey can begin by significant and deeper reading. Mm-hmm. This is part of our mission, and it has been the whole life's dedication of Robert P. Waxler, professor of English at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. What didn't I ask you that you'd like to include and have our listeners take away from our conversation about your new book?
Yeah. Well, let me just mention a couple of things about the new book. Just give people a little better understanding of perhaps what it is. It's a book that discusses, in addition to some of the themes that we've just sort of covered, a number of primarily novels that people are familiar with, perhaps, or have read at one point or another. So there's a chapter, for example, discussing Frankenstein, which a story that a lot of people are familiar with. And what I try to do there is, again, sort of demonstrate, if you're reading deeply and you're paying a lot of attention, here's my voice combined with the voices really of thousands of students that I've listened to over the years talking about it.
Sure.
So there's Frankenstein, there's Alice in Wonderland, there's Old Man and the Sea. These are each chapters, but chapters of hopefully familiar novels. Catcher in the Rye, another chapter, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Fight Club, there's some of them, and as I mentioned, there's this chapter on the first three sections of Genesis. Mm-hmm. And my hope would be that people would pick up the book, even if they've read only a couple of these books before. They might say, geez, it'd be interesting to see what his take is on this, and then perhaps they'll read it, perhaps they'll see something new in that discussion, and then maybe they'll go back to the book, and then in turn they'll go out and talk to other people about it. And again, another aspect of this is, in terms of the risk of reading, the title, that I am trying to argue that literature is probably the most important tool that we still have within our culture to keep ourselves human, in the traditional sense of that word, and to keep the world human. And to build a kind of a democratic society where we understand and listen to people and are willing to stay open to the language of other people.
That's how things get better.
I think that's, if any way, that's the best way to do it.
Yes.
Through, in that sense, literature can contribute something important.
Finally, folks, I do highly recommend that you purchase a copy of The Risk of Reading, How Literature Helps Us to Understand Ourselves and the World. Finally, what has all of your life's experiences taught you about the risks of our own lives, of our own selves?
Right.
What have you learned through literature and through life itself?
Well, that's a profound question. That's the journey we're on, I would suggest. I mean, that's what we're attempting to discover, each in our own way and also collectively. I mean, certainly one thing that I think is important, and again, it's goes back to some of the other thematic issues that we've been talking about, is that it's important, and I think this is something you see in great literature continuously, it's important for us to recognize that we are all mortal human beings. So we have certain limitations because we're human. We're not godlike. And we're also mortal in the ultimate sense of limitation, that we are, like everyone else, we're going to die. Mm-hmm. And so you want to, every day, sort of take that with you and think about it as you encounter other people who are in front of you. We're all mortal. We're all inevitably sentenced to that death. And in that sense, I think there's a kind of acknowledgement and recognition that we're all vulnerable human beings.
Right.
And what we want to do as ethical human beings is to engage with other people as much as possible to acknowledge their vulnerability and to understand through compassion that we're all in this together. And I think if we move in that direction, we become perhaps a little more ethical, but and a little more compassionate. But at least we've got a better chance of sort of living a human and richly textured life. And again, this goes, in my mind, right back to the main argument that I'm trying to make about literature. Literature helps us to feel that, to apprehend it, to sort of sense through language the compassion of and the mortality of life. The ultimate risk, in that sense, the risk of reading, is that at some level, when we get into the depths of the great story, we feel the vulnerability of it.
Yes.
We see that there's something deep within ourselves and within the world that is a reminder that we are somewhat, we are limited, we are mortal, we're vulnerable, and we want to reach out to other people, because as long as we're still alive, we can at least participate in that human community, and we want to not only help other people, but in a sense we want to be part of that community, right? When we're dead, when we no longer participate.
Robert P. Waxler, ladies and gentlemen. Wow, thank you for enriching our lives and the airwaves of this radio talk show.
Phil, thank you so much. It's always very enjoyable to be with you and to talk with you.
Feeling is mutual, and thank you for all the great, good things that you have done with your wife to make this a better world.
Thanks so much.